At 25, Rachel thought she had found her perfect match in Dr. Richard Sterling, a successful 60-year-old surgeon who swept her off her feet with luxury and attention. 6 months after their wedding, Rachel was organizing Richard's home office when she found his old medical licenses. The name on the 2009 certificate made her blood run cold. Dr. Richard Sterling had been the surgeon who killed her mother through medical negligence 15 years ago. Rachel had been working as a waitress at an upscale restaurant downtown when Dr. Richard Sterling first walked into her life. He was distinguished, confident, and incredibly generous with tips. "You're too beautiful to be working so hard," he told her during his third visit. Richard told her stories about saving children's lives in the operating room and volunteering at free clinics. At 60, he seemed like a humanitarian hero who could give Rachel the stability she had never known growing up poor after her mother's death. Within 3 months, Richard was showering Rachel with expensive gifts while sharing heartwarming stories about his medical missions to Haiti and his work with children's cancer patients. "I want to take care of you like I take care of my patients," he would say, holding her close. "You deserve the world." Rachel had never experienced such attention from someone so accomplished and selfless. Her friends warned her about the 35-year age gap, but Rachel felt she had found a true hero who genuinely cared about making the world better. Their wedding was everything Rachel had dreamed of as a little girl. Richard spared no expense, a designer dress that cost more than Rachel used to make in a year, flowers flown in from Europe, a reception at the city's most exclusive country club. "Nothing is too good for my beautiful bride," Richard declared during his speech. Rachel felt like a princess. All her coworkers from the restaurant attended, amazed at Rachel's transformation from struggling waitress to wealthy doctor's wife. The honeymoon in Italy was magical. Richard was attentive, romantic, and constantly telling Rachel how lucky he felt to have found her. "You've brought such joy back into my life," he said as they walked through Rome. "My first marriage was cold and loveless, but you make me feel young again." Rachel had never been outside the country before. Everything felt like a fairy tale: the ancient cities, the expensive hotels, the way Richard treated her like royalty. She thought she had found her happily ever after. Moving into Richard's mansion felt surreal to Rachel. The house had 12 rooms, a swimming pool, and more space than she knew what to do with. Richard encouraged her to quit her waitressing job. "I want you to focus on being happy," he said. "Maybe take some art classes, learn to paint, enjoy life." Rachel spent her days shopping, decorating, and learning to be a wealthy housewife. She bought expensive furniture and artwork, feeling guilty about spending so much money but loving her new lifestyle. Richard was the perfect husband during those first 6 months. He brought her flowers every Friday, took her to expensive restaurants, and introduced her to his wealthy friends as my beautiful young wife. Rachel noticed some of his colleagues seemed uncomfortable with their age difference, but Richard didn't care. "Let them be jealous," he would laugh. "I have something they don't. A wife who actually loves me." Rachel felt protected and cherished in ways she had never experienced before. Life was perfect. One Saturday morning, Richard asked Rachel to help organize his home office while he played golf. "Just sort through those old files and throw away anything from before 2010, he instructed casually. "I need to make space for current patient records." Rachel was happy to help. The office was cluttered with decades of medical documents, certificates, and awards. She started sorting through boxes of papers, amazed at how accomplished her husband was. Richard had degrees from prestigious universities and commendations from multiple hospitals. As Rachel organized the documents chronologically, she found Richard's medical licenses from different years. Each certificate showed his progression through medical school, residency, and various hospital positions. She was proud to see her husband's impressive career history. But when she reached the 2009 documents, something made her pause. One certificate was from St. Catherine's Hospital, the same hospital where her mother had died 15 years ago. Rachel's hands started trembling as uncomfortable memories began flooding back. The name triggered a strange feeling of déjà vu, like a forgotten nightmare trying to surface from her subconscious mind. Why did this hospital name feel so familiar and frightening? Rachel tried to push the feeling away, but something deep inside told her to keep looking. Rachel stared at the certificate, and suddenly the horrible memory crashed back. St. Catherine's Hospital, that was where her mother had died 15 years ago. Her hands started trembling as she remembered that terrible day in 2009 when she was just 10 years old. Her mother, Linda Martinez, had gone to St. Catherine's Hospital for what should have been routine gallbladder surgery. "I'll be home in 2 days, sweetheart," her mother had promised. But something went wrong during the operation. The surgeon had accidentally cut an artery, and Linda bled to death on the operating table. Rachel's father was devastated, and the family received a small settlement from the hospital's insurance company. The surgeon's name had been burned into Rachel's memory because her father repeated it so many times during his grief and anger. "Dr. Richard Sterling killed your mother," her father would say bitterly. "His carelessness took her away from us." Rachel had been too young to understand medical malpractice, but she knew that Dr. Sterling's mistake had destroyed her family. Her father never recovered emotionally and died of a heart attack 3 years later. Rachel had spent her teenage years in foster care, dreaming of the day she could confront her mother's killer. But she had never expected to find him, and certainly never expected to marry him. Rachel stared at the 2009 medical license in her hands, reading the name over and over: Dr. Richard Sterling, Chief of Surgery, St. Catherine's Hospital. Her mind raced as she tried to process this impossible coincidence. There had to be another explanation. Maybe it was a different Dr. Richard Sterling. Maybe she was remembering the name wrong. But deep in her heart, Rachel knew the truth. The man she had married, the man she loved, the man she trusted with her life. He was the surgeon who had killed her mother through negligence. Rachel's hands were shaking violently as she searched through more documents from 2009. She found hospital reports, malpractice insurance claims, and legal settlements. One document made her stomach turn: settlement agreement, estate of Linda Martinez, vs. Dr. Richard Sterling and St. Catherine's Hospital, $75,000 compensation for surgical error, resulting in patient death. Rachel collapsed into Richard's leather chair, crying uncontrollably. Her husband was her mother's killer, and he had no idea who she really was. The man who held her every night, who told her he loved her, who had given her everything she thought she wanted, was the same man who had destroyed her childhood and taken away the most important person in her life. How was this possible? How could fate be so cruel? Rachel felt like her world was crashing down around her. Rachel spent the rest of the weekend researching everything she could find about her mother's case while Richard was at his medical conference. Online court records confirmed her worst fears. Dr. Richard Sterling had been sued for medical malpractice in 2009 after accidentally severing Linda Martinez's hepatic artery during gallbladder surgery. The patient had bled to death despite emergency efforts. The case was settled out of court. Dr. Sterling was quietly transferred to a different hospital to avoid publicity. Rachel found more disturbing information about Richard's medical career. He had been involved in 3 other malpractice cases over the years, all involving surgical errors that resulted in patient deaths or permanent disabilities. Each time, the hospital had covered up the incidents and transferred him to new positions. Richard had built his wealth not through medical excellence, but through a career of protected negligence that destroyed families like Rachel's. She realized she had married a serial killer who used a scalpel instead of a gun. The humanitarian stories he told her, the charitable work he claimed to do, it was all a lie to cover up his incompetence and the trail of victims he had left behind. Rachel felt sick thinking about all the families who had suffered because of Richard's carelessness, just like her own family had. Rachel faced an impossible choice. Should she confront Richard immediately or gather more evidence first? Should she call the police or try to get justice another way? She was now living in the home of her mother's killer, sleeping in his bed, wearing jewelry bought with money that should have gone to malpractice victims. Every kiss, every gift, every I love you had been a betrayal of her mother's memory. Rachel felt sick thinking about how Richard had touched her, with the same hands that had killed her mother. That night, Rachel lay in bed next to Richard, studying his sleeping face in the moonlight. This man had destroyed her childhood, killed her mother, and now had unknowingly married his victim's daughter. Was this fate giving Rachel the chance for justice that the legal system had failed to provide? She could poison his food, sabotage his car, or expose his medical negligence to destroy his career. But Rachel was not a killer. She needed to find another way to make Richard pay for his crimes while protecting herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had fallen in love with the man who had ruined her life. But now that she knew the truth, every moment spent pretending to be happy felt like torture. Rachel needed to be smart about this. She needed evidence, allies, and a plan that would ensure Richard faced real consequences for his actions. For the next 2 weeks, Rachel forced herself to act normal while planning her next move. She cooked Richard's favorite meals, smiled when he kissed her, and pretended to be the loving young wife he believed he had married. But inside, Rachel was dying. Every time Richard told her he loved her, she wanted to scream, "You killed my mother." Every time he touched her, she felt disgusted. Rachel was performing the role of her life, hiding her true identity. While living with her family's destroyer, the emotional toll was enormous. Richard seemed oblivious to Rachel's internal struggle. He continued treating her like a princess, buying her expensive gifts and planning romantic dinners. "You seem quiet lately," he mentioned one evening. "Are you feeling okay?" Rachel forced a smile. "Just tired," she lied. "I love you so much." The words tasted like poison in her mouth. Rachel was trapped in a nightmare, where she had to pretend to love the man who had destroyed her life. She needed help, but who could she trust with this impossible situation? Rachel couldn't tell her friends. They would never believe such an incredible coincidence. She couldn't go to the police without evidence, and she couldn't confront Richard directly without putting herself in danger. Rachel felt completely alone, carrying this devastating secret while pretending her marriage was perfect. Rachel began secretly photographing all of Richard's medical documents, creating a comprehensive file of his malpractice history. She discovered that Richard had never been properly disciplined for his errors because he had powerful connections within the medical establishment. Hospital administrators had covered up his mistakes to protect their reputations. Rachel realized that her mother's death was part of a larger pattern of medical negligence that had been systematically hidden from the public for decades. Using her access to Richard's personal files, Rachel contacted other families who had been victims of his medical errors. She found the widow of a man who died during Richard's botched heart surgery in 2012, and the parents of a child who was permanently disabled after Richard's mistake during brain surgery in 2015. These families had received small settlements and been forced to sign agreements, non-disclosure agreements. Rachel convinced them to break their silence and work together to expose Richard's crimes publicly. Each family had suffered in isolation, believing they were alone in their tragedy. But together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored or covered up. Rachel felt a sense of purpose growing within her anger. She wasn't just seeking revenge for her mother, she was fighting for justice for all of Richard's victims. Rachel contacted investigative journalist Sarah Chen, who specialized in medical malpractice cases. "I have evidence that Dr. Richard Sterling has been killing patients through negligence for over 15 years. Rachel explained, "and I have access to documents that prove hospitals have been covering it up." Sarah was immediately interested. Together, they built an airtight case against Richard, complete with hospital records, witness testimony, and expert medical opinions that proved his pattern of deadly negligence. The story broke on a Tuesday morning with the headline, "Surgeon of Death: How Dr. Richard Sterling Killed 7 Patients Through Medical Negligence." The article detailed every malpractice case, every cover-up, and every family that had been silenced with settlements. Rachel had provided the documents that made the story possible, but she kept her identity secret. She watched from the kitchen as Richard read the article. On his tablet, his face going white with terror as his crimes were finally exposed to the world. Within hours, Richard's colleagues were calling, his country club was revoking his membership, and reporters were camping outside their mansion. Rachel watched the news coverage showing her neighbors expressing shock. "He seemed like such a caring doctor," one said. "His young wife must be devastated." Rachel almost laughed at the irony. She was the architect of his destruction. If only they knew the truth, the devastated young wife was actually the daughter of one of his victims, and she had orchestrated his downfall. Rachel felt a satisfaction she had never experienced before. Finally, after 15 years, her mother was getting the justice she deserved. Richard's carefully constructed image as a respected surgeon was crumbling, and the world was seeing him for what he really was, a killer. "Richard," Rachel said calmly, walking into the living room where her husband sat in shock. "We need to talk." Richard looked up with confused, frightened eyes. "I don't understand how this reporter got all this information," he stammered. "Someone must have broken into hospital files." Rachel sat down across from him and pulled out a photograph, her mother's hospital picture from 2009. "Do you remember Linda Martinez?" Richard's face went completely pale as recognition dawned. "You killed my mother 15 years ago." Richard stared at the photograph, then at Rachel's face, finally seeing the resemblance to the woman he had killed through negligence. "Oh my God," he whispered. "You're Linda's daughter. You married me for revenge." Rachel nodded calmly. "I didn't plan this, Richard. I fell in love with you before I knew who you were. But now I know the truth. You destroyed my family, and you've been destroying other families for years." Richard reached for her hand, but Rachel pulled away. "Please, we can work through this. I can make amends. I can help other families." Rachel stood up, her voice cold and final. "It's too late for that, Richard. You had 15 years to make amends, and instead you continued hurting people. The only thing you can do now is face the consequences of your actions." Rachel walked toward the door, then turned back one last time. "Goodbye, Richard. I hope my mother can finally rest in peace." Within hours of the article's publication, Richard's world collapsed completely. His medical license was suspended, criminal charges were filed, and his hospital fired him immediately. The media circus was enormous. News vans lined their street. Former patients gave interviews, and medical experts debated his case on television. Rachel watched reporters describing her as the young trophy wife who must be devastated by these revelations. If only they knew the truth, she was the mastermind behind his downfall. Rachel filed for divorce the same day, keeping all the evidence she had gathered against Richard. She testified at his trial, finally getting the justice her mother deserved 15 years after her death. Richard was sentenced to 20 years in prison for negligent homicide and medical fraud. Rachel used his mansion and assets to establish a foundation that helps families affected by medical malpractice. She had found love with her enemy. Sometimes the greatest love stories are really the greatest revenge stories. Justice always finds a way, even through the heart. If this story shocked you about love, betrayal, and medical negligence revealing truth, please like, subscribe, and share. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed how you saw someone you trusted? Tell us your story in the comments below.